Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. Today, we're going to turn our attention to one of the most urgent issues of our time. And that is, how does one understand and deal with violence at a mass level? And how can nonviolence be of effective utility in the face of coercive force? You look around the world today, the world is caught up in escalating violence at almost every level. Violence against gays and transgender people in Uganda, where there's now a law that they can actually be executed. Violence against various minorities in various countries around the world. One thinks of the Kurds in Turkey and Iraq. Violence against women in the United States, where they're now deprived of the right even over the sovereignty of their bodies. Violence between the superpowers as the United States and Russia and the United States and China escalate conflict and military preparations, with a real war going on in Ukraine and a potential war going on in Asia over Taiwan. It's an extraordinary moment in history that at the very moment when we need each other the most urgently to deal with a range of global issues, at the heart of which is runaway climate change, the human race is choosing escalating violence that is making impossible any kind of collaboration to solve challenges that could actually lead to the extinction of the human race itself. It's extraordinary. And it's worth just pondering and taking in this disconnect in our psyches between what we should be doing and we seem to want to do instead. It's really amazing, particularly when you think of the escalating war in Ukraine and the conflict between superpowers. There's also conflict in nation states. And today we want to focus on one particular nation, and that's Iran, where for the last 40 years, a repressive and coercive fundamentalist regime seizing power after the overthrow of the Shah that had been put in by the United States following a coup where they overthrew a legitimate government in Iran, and that set in motion a cycle of violence and repression that continues to the present day. And then last year, a young woman, Mahsa Amini, who didn't have her scarf on correctly, her job on correctly, was brutally killed. And that ignited, in a highly mysterious way, a revolt in Iran, a protest in Iran, largely ignited initially by young women who refused to wear the hijab and took it off and simply wanted the space to be who they are. It spread to China against the strictures of COVID. Again, the similar protest and demand by young people that they simply wanted the space to be human. And it was almost entirely nonviolent, but it caused a global meme to be created, largely centered around young women and young people generally, in a very nonviolent way to just simply have the right to be who they are in a world in which, given the internet and all kinds of technology, almost everything is possible. And the response of the regime was a repression that has led to a massive number of executions in the first 5 months of 2023 alone, according to Human Rights Watch. There have been 192 executions in Iran, 8 of which were against women. The only country in the world that has more executions is China. And so today we want to really update ourselves on what's going on in Iran. As you know, we've had many programs on the issue of violence and nonviolence, and we've looked at Iran because of this extraordinary courage on the part of young women and young people generally to defy a regime in such a not only courageous, but I would say almost innocent way, with the most simple demand any human being can ever make. And that is a demand for the right to be who they are. Before we dive into this program, let us just center ourselves, as we always do on Humanity Rising, and let us just breathe consciously, coherently, together. So in a moment, you'll hear the sound of a bell. When you hear the bell, just breathe in slowly. Then you'll hear another bell and breathe out. We're going to take 10 breaths together, and then we'll commence our program. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. It's always so good to breathe together in a chaotic world, particularly when we have to take up subjects like we're going to take up today, where we really contemplate some of the deep contradictions and polarities in the human psyche and the human soul that play themselves out in society, in politics, in culture, and in our history. I would like to invite now Sarah Eskandari, who's Iranian. She's a young woman from Iran who's at the University of Pennsylvania doing her PhD dissertation on the issue of gender and pilgrimage and revolution in modern Iran, basically looking at the last century or so of Iranian history and contemplating these very profound issues. We're also going to hear from Michael Nagler, who you all know from his previous appearances on Humanity Rising, one of the leading theorists on nonviolence, emeritus professor of classics and comparative literature at UC Berkeley, who since the 1970s, when he established the Metta Center there, has been involved in speaking forcefully for the urgent need for all of us to understand nonviolence and to apply nonviolence in our everyday lives and also in our communities and in our international relations. We're going to start today with Sarah. So Sarah, please join us. And she's going to tell us, let's start, Sarah, just tell us about your life and how your life in Iran and when and how and why you left and how you ended up at the University of Pennsylvania doing such an audacious thesis. It's quite a massive topic that you've taken on. So we want to hear all about it. And then after your presentation, we'll bring in Michael to talk about the current situation in Iran. But welcome.
Thank you so much for your kind and generous introduction, Jim. And I'm really grateful to you for organizing this event and having me here. I'm also really honored to participate in another panel discussion with Dr. Nagler. Today, I would like to talk about student situation in Iran and also the connection between the academia and activism. But before that, I would like to say a few words about why I ended up here. I think the answer is very simple. I was one of the women who was suffering from gender apartheid and was struggling with the deep-rooted patriarchy. I also come from a very religious and traditional family that actually multiplied my difficulties. I can talk about it later, about the details, my relationship with my dad. When I started doing research after I received my master's degree, I began realizing that how difficult doing research is, in academic and research centers. I noticed how censorship can prevent me from expressing my thoughts, and digging into archives and analysis was not really enough to prove my academic capability. I had to censor myself. I had to censor my findings and make sure that everything that I say or write would meet the Islamic regime's, expectations. So I felt like I was all the time scrutinized. I also couldn't, bear the boundaries of us versus them created by the Islamic regime. It was really humiliating. I was also, like many Iranian women, I'm one of them who has been detained frequently by the Islamic Republic Morality Police. And I always say this, and I'm going to repeat it, that I could have been Mahsa, because I ended up police station. I was at the jail once, and there are so many things happening. And if we have time, I would definitely bring them up. So I decided to leave. I decided to leave and apply for PhD programs, and I got into Penn and a couple of other schools, but I decided to choose Penn because of my advisor, Dr. Firuze Kashani Sabet. I thought that she could be the best supervisor for my research. And I was really right about it. Okay, so let's get to the point and talk about student situation in Iran that I think is very crucial for us to know what's happening exactly. Before Mahsa's murder on September, Iranian universities have been at the forefront of the protest movement, and this is not the first time university campuses join protest. The difference is that they were kept, unfortunately, politically dormant more than a decade, and then erupted after Mahsa's murder. More than 150, I would say, universities have been the scene of peaceful protest and sit-ins against the Islamic regime, and as usual, they have been suppressed violently. Hundreds of students have been expelled from university and dorms. Many of them have been arrested and killed by the armed force. Professors also and lecturers have been fired or suspended for supporting the Women Life Freedom revolutionary movement and for not actually helping the regime find the students who attended the protest. In the first couple of months of the movement, we witnessed the campus crackdown. The security forces opened fire at students at Sharif University. That is a long story. In Tehran, and students describe the campuses as war zones, and some describe it as the darkest and the most horrifying day in the history of the university, Sharif University. So the crackdown did not actually stop students from expressing their demands and expressing their oppositions. So they refused to attend classes, and they were very creative actually in leaving some symbols or words on the class's door. They demanded unconditional release of all arrested students, the cancellation also of arrest warrants, and the lifting of academic suspension. They also demanded withdrawal of security forces from campuses that made a kind of terror atmosphere. Unfortunately and unsurprisingly, the regime has kept expelling students, threatening them, so that they are trying to, these days to remain unidentified. One example is Zabul University, where more than 16 students were expelled. Since the revolution, the authorities have cracked down campuses repeatedly. They attacked campuses in other cities, expelled students and arrested them or banned them from higher education. It's really not that easy to keep track of the number of expelled students. In Iran, we call them danishjuy setaredar. Literally means a student who has a star. It means that this student has been expelled because of her political thoughts. And again, we hear that more than 40 female students of fine arts were expelled in the last month alone, to suppress the women-led uprising. And before that, actually 20, if I'm not mistaken, 20 students of Tehran University were banned from education. So deprivation of education obviously is a tool to suppress the uprising. During the uprising professors played an important role in supporting students. For example, during the violent crackdown at Sharif University, some of them approached the armed force and tried to negotiate a secure exit for students, but they were beaten up violently. Some of them even tried to take some female students, away in their car, but it was, useless. It was seized. Their cars, were seized by the armed force and were choked with baton. Some faculty members stopped teaching and demanded the release of their students and their guaranteed actually safety. So we see these academics inside Iran have supported women life freedom, released statesmen condemning the regime, and they paid the price. Some of them have been dismissed, and some have been suspended. Here I want to emphasize the role of academia and their academics' responsibility, especially outside Iran, to speak up, give speeches, write statements, sign petitions, and teach students and others what has been happening and what mechanisms and what skills actually Iranians should use to achieve concrete results. I'm saying this not just because many academics in Iran paid a heavy price for supporting the movement. It is a good reason, but it's not the only reason. Much further, actually, I do think that academia and activism should be bridged because theory and action are tightly connected. I actually brought this up at a conference held in Beirut in Lebanon titled Critical Knowledge in the Arab Region. I discussed at a workshop titled From Iran and Beyond, Bodily Debates and Transnational Solidarity in Swana. So I can give you some examples about the importance of this connection, why I think that academia and activism should be bridged. For example, Dr. Nagler, I had the honor to host Dr. Nagler a couple of times. The last one was last month, actually, at the University of Pennsylvania. And he brought up a couple of points that were accessible and actionable. He has developed some theories and concepts about nonviolent resistance. But everyday people need to hear and learn those theories and concepts. And I'm glad to see that Dr. Nagler's scholarly works have reached, general audiences, and, his talks and his activities outside academia, outside academic environment are very crucial in teaching resistance, nonviolent resistance in democratic movements. Or I have, other examples, such as my advisor, Professor Firuze Kashani Sabet. She really enlightened us in the first few events that we organized in Philadelphia. I myself printed some posters in some events with short explanations that showed the timeline of the Islamic Republic brutality. And even many Iranians reached out to me and said, oh, they had no idea about those crimes. Or, for example, many Iranians, they did not know that the very first protest in Iran after the revolution, the Islamic Revolution of 1979, happened by women against the hijab, against the mandatory hijab, the point that we are today. So these examples are to show why it matters that academics, beside their scholarly works, stay outside academia and talk about their scholarly works and sometimes they also need to have a very simple conversation to make sure that audiences would understand and learn those concepts, those research, those theories. I had a discussion with a friend of mine, Ladana Zarabadi. She is a PhD student in gender studies at UCLA. We were talking about the movement last week, and she was saying that she mentioned something that I think is very important to bring up here. She was saying that sometimes theories are not even accessible, understandable, let alone actionable. So this is something that academics should consider in their scholarly works, because we want to make sure that the concepts, the theories reach a broader audience, right? Everyday people. I also want to emphasize that I do believe and acknowledge that academic works itself is activism, right? At the same time, we should acknowledge that sometimes scholarly works, as I mentioned, are not easy to understand. So I think academics' responsibility is to first develop at least accessible theories. Second, try to teach them not just in classrooms, but also in public spaces, in person or remote, and engage a broader audience. This is especially very important during extraordinary situations, like current situation in Iran. We need academics' voices about general events related to the women life freedom movements and other movements. Their scholarly analysis on the events and their efforts actually in raising awareness is really, I think, fundamental. Some may disagree with me, saying that writing books or like articles itself is activism. That's fair enough, and I won't disagree. However, we all know having an article published in a peer-reviewed journal sometimes takes years, especially in humanity majors. So it is very important to speak up about important events through media or conferences or organizing panel discussions immediately to make sure that the responses to the current situation is really effective. So I believe that to have an effective protest on our path toward democracy, scholars in social sciences, political science, history, philosophy, anthropology, and others are really great sources who can teach us mechanisms by which Iranians would achieve a good result. They can also design a course about this. For example, we have Dr. Lisa Muller, if I'm not mistaken, like her pronunciation, a professor of political science who designed a course about this. So academics can turn I believe, classrooms into a way of activism, and also can turn public spaces or social media into a classrooms. Something that we have seen many academics have already done, right? After the revolutionary movement sparked, like Dr. Mahmoud Fard, Dr. Nayir Tawhidi, Dr. Mateen, Dr. Nagler. Even in other fields, I would say, like engineering and physics, we see scientists actually at Penn. Some of them organized panels in the very first weeks of the movement and tried to raise awareness about the situation. Sadly, though, some of the most distinguished scholars and social scientists have remained silent and are hesitant to talk about this movement. And this is something that obviously we should think and work on and see why they are silent. This is another topic, complicated and actually a heated topic of discussion, and it requires another session. One thing that I want to highlight is an importance is the importance of one point that Dr. Nagler brought up in one of the webinars that I was hosting. He mentioned that, I think it was in the last one. You can correct me, Michael. Yeah, it was in the last one. Michael mentioned that we should switch from confrontational mode into conversational mode, something that we need to work at it, to learn. And I believe academics can play a significant role. If we accept that academics are leading thinkers who can guide people toward a better future, then they can really help open up discussion and encourage everyday people to have a conversation, to create discourse. Like, about this movement, it really matters to hear different discourses and having conversations about those discourses. I actually created a new Instagram page to share educational events, talks, and panel discussions to help learn having this conversation and listen to each other, hear different layers of the movement and other democratic movements in the world, and actually learn nuances. So having a discourse can change, obviously, our attitudes toward different aspects of life, and conversation would help us exchange information. It creates knowledge that can then be used to inform decision makers. Importance of discourse and conversation is not just for, I would say, regime change. It is necessary for every single change we see in society. So in this revolutionary movement over the past couple of months, I believe that we need to strengthen this aspect, encourage people to set regular meetings on campuses, coffee shops, or any public spaces where people can get together and talk. It is, of course, happening on social media through the posts and stories, but I believe in-person gathering matters too. So these gatherings could consist of 2, 3, 4 or more, among your friends, among our colleagues, or maybe in a bigger circle. I think what I'm gonna say is that it doesn't have to be formal. It can happen during our break time at school, when you are having tea, with your cohort. It can happen at a party when you are going for a walk with a friend. So I mean to say that there are many ways that we can open up conversation and create discourse around this uprising and other, democratic movements. So I think all these events, academics engagement outside academia would help us have a clear, vision of what we want to achieve. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Sarah. A very powerful presentation. It reminded me so much of my experience in revolutionary fervor during the 1960s. Because you're so right, it's in the universities and in academia where the foment of revolution often comes, because that's the one place in society where conversations and dialogue and intellectual exploration and experimentation are encouraged and sanctioned, at least in most situations. And I remember, for example, there was what we call teach-ins. These professors and activists, we would all gather at Sproul Hall. You'll remember Michael at UC Berkeley. And Michael, you might as well come in because you will know this intimately from your own experience. But the teach-ins at Sproul Hall back in the 60s, where they just, we were kids. I was, 17, 18 years old. I didn't know very much about Vietnam. And the teach-ins, as you're pointing out, Sarah, were really important in just informing us in a non-adversarial way. These are the facts, and you need to think about them. And the dialogues and the debates that we had were just such an extraordinary animation of the young psyche, at least in my particular case. And along with all the other young men, I burned my draft card and refused to go to Vietnam. And it was a wonderful initiation into adulthood and a realization that our governments can sometimes be guilty of great crimes. And it's very important for intellectuals and the young to speak out against that. In fact, I don't know of very many revolutions where the young people and the intellectuals weren't involved, whether there even was a revolution. So anyway, Michael, let's start with you. What's your comment on what Sarah has just said? And Sarah, stay in the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, please. Yeah. My first comment, Sarah, is thank you and congratulations. That was insightful and illuminating in just the way that I hoped it would be. It made me think of so many things. I know that Gandhi was once asked, do you really believe that nonviolence is the best way forward for India? And he said no, which shocked the person asking him. He said, no, it's not the best way. It's the only way. Because nonviolence is the only way that we really all move forward, as opposed to simply renegotiating the power imbalances among us. And during the free speech movement, we did try to elevate this idea of nonviolence. The stakes were a lot lower than they are in Tehran, I have to say, but the dynamic was exactly the same. I think the forces were exactly the same. And incidentally, if I remember correctly, the major protests and teach-ins, the teach-in movement against the Vietnam War was started at Pennsylvania by Kenneth Boulding.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's correct. So we're coming back to the origin. Now, I want to also comment a little bit, Sarah, on what you said about theory and practice. Of course, there is a danger among academics in particular that they can escape into theory and not get engaged in the realities of life. I remember during the 1970s when there were a lot of upheaval in Paris, one professor was approached by his students and said, come on. He was involved in what was called structuralism in those days, a very short-lived, very interesting approach to the way meaning is understood. And he said, "Le structuralisme ne descend pas dans les rues." Structuralism does not descend into the streets. He stayed in his ivory tower. On the other extreme, there are many examples, some of which you cited, and one that I've written about recently was the White Rose conspiracy that took place in what may be perhaps the only regime in the world more oppressive and more violent than what's going on in Iran today, which was Nazi Germany. The students wrote pamphlets and scattered them around the University of Munich. And they were eventually betrayed by a janitor, and they were all executed, except one who came to visit us at Berkeley and told us this story that when the Gestapo came for her and the other students, she was out sick. And they went to her professor and they said, "Where is she? And we want her because she's involved in this uprising." And the professor said, "Her? She couldn't possibly be involved." He knew perfectly well that she was a key member of the White Rose. But the respect for learning and the respect for professors was such that the Gestapo had no choice but to believe him and leave her alone. And I met her 25 years later at Berkeley. Speaking of Berkeley and the intersection between theory and practice, which I'll get back to in a second, I would say in my academic life, which is pretty far behind me now, I was a student of Homer. You know about the Greeks and the Persians. Sarah, there was a little bit of a difficulty there in the 5th century, but we're over that now. And Homer's oral poetry was a very interesting approach to repetition, repetitiveness. Usually he didn't repeat a whole line, a whole hexameter verbatim from one part of the epics to another. But there's one line that occurs 4 times in exactly the same form. And translated, it means, this is being spoken by one of the heroes, one of the Greek warriors, Telemachus and others. And in there, what the line is, I'm in charge here because I can control the women. So at that stage, we see a very important dynamic that is playing out today in Iran, and I think underappreciated, that the conflict really isn't ultimately between men and women. It's between men and men using women as a token in the game, in a competitive game that they play. I don't know exactly where to go with that. Not all elements of theory translate immediately into praxis, but I think this would be a very good thing for us to understand, that the violence against women should not be studied in isolation, even though it hurts so much. It's such a particularly grievous form of violence, and we want to get in and stop it. It has to be understood in this larger context, that the more violence there is, the more there will be this tendency to what this is called unanimous violence, that rather than men fighting it out together, they use women as victims. Now, having said all of that, I do recur to my main point that I think that nonviolence is the answer. As Gandhi made very clear, nonviolence is really the implementation of truth. And truth is the ultimate weapon and the ultimate goal. That makes nonviolence the most important and effective method or tool or dynamic to use. And I'm glad to see that it's playing a role in almost all revolutions in the modern period. There's some very good studies by Dr. Erica Chenoweth at Harvard, who has shown that the number of uprisings, even though they can be brutally repressed, the number of uprisings that try to cling to nonviolence has been increasing with very great effectiveness, because, and this gets back to some of your original remarks, Jim, that this is a part of human evolution, that human consciousness is evolving towards a greater understanding that nonviolence is the ultimate mode in which we should be operating amongst one another on every level. And that's because of the ultimate question of who we are. If we think that we're separate beings, namely that we're, material bodies, violence is kind of natural. If you suffer, it doesn't affect me. But if we believe that we're all interconnected, then I can't possibly wish to injure you because I'd be injuring myself. And as a matter of fact, we're even built for that. We're wired for that. Back in 1988 in Italy, some scientists stumbled upon this incredible discovery of what are called mirror neurons. That is, neurons in the human brain, and probably to some degree in other animals as well, that directly reflect and imitate the experiences of others that they observe. So when you see a person being hurt, you are actually hurting, but you don't necessarily know that. So this, inescapable interconnectedness among us all is actually built into our nervous system. It's completely, it's inescapable, and I don't know why anyone should try to escape it, actually. So now, how would this apply in a really brutal situation like what we're facing today in Iran? Well, there was a study about 20 years ago now by a man named Ralph Sumi, where he addressed the question is probably the utmost question on all of our minds, and I think you mentioned it, Jim. Can nonviolence be applied when the regime is apparently so unresponsive to it, when they're so brutal? He wrote, the paper was called Nonviolence in the Case of the Extremely Brutal Opponent. Extremely ruthless opponent, yeah. And he used the image of judo. In judo, if someone is, if your opponent is really aggressive and jumps on you, the harder he jumps, the easier it is for you to get him on the ground. And it's not dissimilar, but in more complex ways and subtler ways, with large-scale conflicts. That when a regime starts to practice extremes of cruelty and brutality, they are really, so to say, signing their death warrant. They're really writing the conclusion of their validity. You can see so many examples of this. For example, in this case, it's not just the regime in charge, but any actor who uses more violence to get further will actually find in the long run that that was extremely counterproductive, to say the least. And one example that comes to mind is the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrilla movement in Peru. The regime was really pretty bad, and the guerrillas were very angry. But what they did was they started assassinating people, and they assassinated so many people that eventually the Peruvian population just got fed up with them. Because they were showing all we can do is assassinate. We don't know how to govern. We don't know how to bring people together. So we shouldn't feel that the ruthlessness of the regime is a strategic disadvantage. It's a horrible thing, and it causes a lot of suffering. And apparently there is no way out of a situation like this without some suffering. But it's deplorable, but from a strategic point of view, we shouldn't feel that it militates against the use of nonviolence. On the contrary, parties who can exhibit nonviolence will make an immediate appeal to the human heart through those mirror neurons and elicit a very different kind of power, which has sometimes been called soft power, but I think that's not a good image for us to use. It's a subtler and more pervasive power. Basically, the power of love. There, I said it, and I'm glad. And the appeal of it is universal. Even the most committed, brutal opponent can be appealed to in some way. So the question is to figure out how. I have a friend, she's living in Atlanta, and she owes her existence to this story. Her parents were Jewish, they were living in Poland, in Warsaw, and they were part of the underground. So one day the Gestapo raided their apartment and they found incriminating evidence and they were about to take them out. But this couple had a 4-year-old boy and he was fascinated by the shiny buttons on the Gestapo captain's uniform. And to the horror of the parents, they looked over and saw this little boy was playing with the captain's uniform, his buttons. And they were terrified that the Gestapo person would notice this. Well, he did. He looked down, he looked at this boy, and he looked up, and his face had completely changed. He was completely softened, and he said, "I have a little boy at home, just like him. And I miss him very much." And he gathered his men and went out of the apartment. And that couple lived to come to the United States and have Lily, who became a very good friend of mine. So my point is that not only is it the case that a brutal regime can be overcome, in some ways, if you know how to play it, it can be overcome even more easily than a subtle kind of repression violence, which is actually Gandhi complained often that the British were being extremely violent, but in a covert way. And his job as a nonviolent actor was to elicit, bring up to the surface. Martin Luther King said exactly the same thing. My job is to get that violence out of you so you can see what you're really doing. So that, I think, the protests in Iran have done very well. Now, the question is, how do we go on from here? One thing that I find encouraging is the Alliance for Democratic Freedom in Iran, because ADFI, because to really have a successful nonviolent, what shall I say, a successful nonviolent movement, just say that, it has to be multifaceted. People think that going out in the street and protesting is it. Well, that's actually the weakest element of nonviolence. Most nonviolence can happen before anybody goes out in the street. What you mostly don't have in most popular movements, looking across, the Arabic world and other parts of our planet here, is you don't have a statement of what you want to substitute for the present regime.
Michael?
Yeah.
I'd like to just interrupt because I'd like to engage in a dialogue
Okay.
for the balance of the time, if that's okay.
It's
You've
okay.
given us a lot of
Yeah.
points to contemplate.
No.
But I want to return to the comment you were making out of Homer about the most powerful is the one who controls the women, and ask you, Sarah, to comment on that. And noted in your introduction, you said you came from a very religiously conservative family. I'm sure your evolution into a revolutionary young woman caused some consternation in your family dynamic, probably, as you indicated, with your father. So I'd like to just focus on that one point from Michael and from Homer, given your experience and given the reality that it was the young women that last year really ignited this new phase of revolutionary protest. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about your upbringing and how you as a young woman, what was your pathway to the positions you now hold?
So it is always difficult for me to talk about my situation, my position in my family, because of my father's political stance. I I'm not religious, but my parents, they're Muslims, and I was always scared. I was always afraid of my dad,
He
because
supports the regime.
yeah, not just because I do, my mom also is very religious, but my mom's political stance is totally different than my dad. So all the time I was feeling like I was scrutinized by my dad. And I always said that I always saw my dad as another Islamic Republic. For those who come from not religious family, but from families who support the system, for them, difficulties, are multiplied, because they are not just facing with one Islamic Republic, with two or more in their family, in their relatives, among their friends, among their colleagues. So it has been very difficult for me, honestly. But after I would say 19, my dad, began learning that he shouldn't, force me. He shouldn't impose. He always admonished me for example, having an so-called inappropriate hijab, or for not following Islamic rules, for not valuing common norms, traditional and religious norms. But one way that I did to fight non-violently, obviously, was just unveiling, getting unveiled, in front of my dad, in front of my relatives, my friends. And I wanted my dad to see that. Unfortunately, many disagreed at the time, and even now, some of maybe our audiences, they disagree with me. They say that, wow, that you should have respected your dad, because this is something that is very, I would say, unfortunately, is very common in our culture, that we say, okay, just do it for your dad out of respect. Just respect your dad and just cover your head. I didn't believe that it was a respect. It was a lie. I didn't want to pretend. Unfortunately, this is something that the Islamic regime has done to Iranians, force them to pretend, So in society, when you want to get employed, you have to lie, you have to cover your head, you have to pretend, even though they know that you're lying. But they say that, okay, you just say that you believe in Islamic rules, even if they are really certain about your political and, ideological stances. So I think it paid off. It paid off because after me, my siblings also got unveiled. And my dad, it was so hard for him to take it. He couldn't take it. And he always said that, I won't forgive you. I did everything for you, and you are going against me. You are going against values, common norms. But now these days, when I talk to my siblings, my mom, they say that, like, your dad cannot do anything because this is something that what should he do? You know what I'm saying? So there is nothing that in this non-violent resistance he could do. So I started from home, and then unfortunately I couldn't change, and we cannot change society, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But I tried my best to fight off. For example, every time that I encountered morality police, I just didn't cover my head or like fix my hijab, as they say, immediately. I started negotiating. I started talking to them that why this is not something, this is my body, my choice. And then when I was forced into the morality police van, or when I was taken to the police stations, then I had to sign a letter saying that, okay, I commit not to break Islamic rules. I'm gonna definitely follow these rules. And that was the last time that I had an so-called inappropriate hijab, and it's not gonna repeat again. So, but that was a lie, because right after signing that letter and after getting out the jail and this police station, again, it was my hair. That is a lie that the Islamic regime is telling to themselves. You know what I'm saying? They know that. They know that right after we are free of security forces, we do whatever we want to do. Yeah, so I'm not sure if that was the answer of your question.
No, it was. Thank you very much. But I think Michael was raising a very important point about power and the subordination of women. And I remember, Banafsheh Sayad reminded us that it was the Ayatollah Khomeini that made the statement early on in the revolution that getting women to wear the hijab was essential to controlling them. And so the fact that you and thousands of others were taking off the hijab really strikes to the heart of the male control over the women in a Islamically fundamentalist regime. I mean, it's both symbolic, but it's also deeply archetypal and therefore more powerful.
Jim, you said the word that I was about to say, that the hijab is a symbol. And there are two kinds of symbols in nonviolence. There are empty symbols that are just by way of saying, I don't like you or I won't go along with you. Or there are symbols that are also pragmatic, they're concrete. And the best example of a concrete symbol was Gandhi's spinning wheel, the charkha. Because you can use that, it's a very nice image. Metta Center has it as our logo. It's very good symbolically, but it also was actual wealth that impoverished Indians were creating for themselves. Now, I've been thinking a lot about this, Sarah, and I don't know if you'd agree, but it seems to me that the hijab is almost as concrete and practical as the symbol and to rally nonviolent energy around a concrete symbol like that seems to be absolutely essential. It's often seemed to me that it was one of the big lacks in Martin Luther King's movement, that he didn't have something that concrete to focus people's attention on.
One thinks of the Salt March as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's Well, Sarah, let's talk about the hijab and that a little more deeply in Iran, because I think Michael's right. You've got something like the spinning wheel going on with the hijab. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure you're in touch with, people, young women and your cohort back in Iran probably on a daily basis. What's the current situation around women in the hijab? Has the Masa Amini kind of protests ebbed and then flowed away? Is it weakening? How strong is the protest right now in Iran, knowing there's been a year of pretty active repression?
So I would say that the mode of protest, the mode of opposition has changed because of the, unfortunately, like the unending crackdown of the regime. So they kept appearing in public spaces unveiled, or what they call loose veil. Like my sisters, my friends, but unfortunately, again, when they are located in some places near security forces, right? Or like morality police, they cannot do this because they really don't want to end up jail, right? So it is I see this continuity, but I also see the change of mode, like because of the crackdown and the number of killed people, more than 600 so far, more than 50 kids, and more than 6 or 7 executions just for this movement. Instead of taking to the streets, Iranians have been trying to just speak up through their windows at night at like 10 or 11 p.m. They decide to shout like down with the dictator, and I really like it. You know, this is a way, a very non-violent way to resist, and it also shows that it has a good message, that a movement, a revolutionary movement, an opposition, a protest doesn't just have one connotation or one type. You know, it comes with different methods and skills. Okay, now the extent of oppression and suppression is too much. No one can take it, you know. So that's why people decided to stay home and go to the streets less than before. I won't say that they don't go, but these days is less than before because
but
of
now they're shouting from the windows. So.
Exactly. And it's so interesting because my niece, every time that they start shouting and like down with the dictator, she calls me and asks me to listen. She says, Aunt Sarah, please listen what we are doing. And I just listen to like their slogans, their chanting, and I'm really glad that they are doing this. But sadly, I also need to highlight this. Even this type of nonviolent resistance, like through your windows, is dangerous because they identify your apartments, something that happened in Tehran, in west of Tehran, in Ekbatan, and some of them were arrested. And they had no idea. They said that many of us, we were like chanting, and we don't know how they identified us, how you know. And because among them, there are also supporters of the regime, right? And when you're listening that your neighbor is like chanting out of window, so they report, right? So this is something that we call, I think we discussed it before, fire at will, آتش به اختیارها, that the Islamic Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei brought up in, if I'm not mistaken, in 2015. His point basically is that people who support the regime, they are responsible to admonish those who don't support the regime and those who break the tradition, who break the Islamic rules, you know. So that's why, unfortunately, this is also another point that every time that I have a talk, I mention that unfortunately we are not just facing systemic patriarchy, we are also facing cultural patriarchy, and also we are facing morality policies that they are not really police, but they are policing, right? They are controlling us, and they report, and they say, they actually threaten us. They say that, okay, in the subway or taxi, wherever, like when they see you that you are your hijab is not fixed, they say that fix your hijab, otherwise we will report, like we will call police right now. And you know that they support us. This is something that unfortunately we are dealing with. Yeah, but the fact that Iranians have found other ways of, you know, peaceful protest is very promising, and we should actually learn. I have learned a lot from them, that some like movement, revolutionary movements doesn't just come with one way, because I have heard it a lot that, oh, like the movement, like we don't hear anything about it, you know, the movement is over, you know, Iranians are tired of yeah, they are tired, but they're tired of getting killed. They're seeing their loved ones killed, right? Yeah. But they're not tired of fighting off the dictator.
You know, this is an example, Michael, of your image of judo. The Iranian people are engaging in one creative judo move after another,
That's right.
and the endless creativity of the nonviolent, because you have to be much. If you're violent, it's easy; you just shoot them, right? But if you're nonviolent, you've got to be a black belt.
Yeah.
In judo to counter that, or because it's not so easy to take on brute force if you're not highly trained and I would say morally creative in the way that you're able to adapt.
Yeah.
Oh, excuse me, Sarah. I'm happy to say that we no longer have to reinvent the wheel. That there are collections and studies now of nonviolent tactics, starting with Gene Sharp, who wrote a book called The Tactics of Nonviolent Action or something like that, where he listed 198 things that you can do. And since then, it's been actually elaborated on. So we now know that there are many ways of expressing resistance. What we need is the strategic acumen to choose which ways will work best. I mean, a classic example of using the wrong method for too long was Tiananmen Square. Again, it was a question of a symbol, one piece of real estate, symbolizing the whole approach to the regime. And so many young lives were lost clinging to that symbol, when if they had had different methods, different techniques to fall back on, they could have said, this isn't working, let's go to that.
Yeah. And I think the other issue, which makes it more insidious in a way, Sarah, is your point that the regime encourages families to inform on other families and fathers on their children and vice versa, and neighbors, and it pits. It's a classic divide and conquer tactic, which makes it so insidious, because it's not the morality police that are in the police cars, it's the morality police right next door.
Right next door, yeah. And that's why unfortunately in Iran we see lots of honor killings. It's very common, but no one can get arrested. And like, why? Because they say that, okay, we didn't ask people to kill their wives, right? Because of like assuming that she was cheating, right? Or we didn't ask you to kill your daughter because of having a boyfriend. They did it. But actually the main, I would say the agency is on the Islamic regime. Those supreme leader who brought up fire at will, آتش به اختیارها, whenever you feel Islam is in danger, shoot people in any way you can. That's why unfortunately there are so many things like honor killing, other like beating up women happening in Iran. And we cannot say that, okay, this is coming from the regime or like morality police. They are very smart, honestly. And one other thing that I was going to add is like the nonviolent resistance that Iranians have had, like students. I think I brought up in the beginning that students have been very creative. Like they leave their notes, their symbols on classes door, chanting, writing like those slogans like "Down with the dictator," "You are a killer," "You are a murderer," and these are ways that they have been doing. But honestly, I cannot say that I am disappointed or I don't have hope. But I think that we have a long journey. It's not that easy to down that dictator. It's not that easy to down, because Iranians are unweaponized. Iranians are fighting off the dictator empty-handedly,
Yeah.
Yeah, and even when they have to defend themselves, when they are brutally attacked, they put it down to violence, and they on social media they say that, wow, like one of the morality polices got killed, or one of the morality polices got wounded, right? But they don't say what we did. We attacked first, and then they defended themselves, right? It's very. I have hope, but I have to be honest. I don't think that downing this dictator, this terrorist that sent terrorists to other countries to kill, like Masih Alinejad, to threaten them, is not that easy. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a quote by someone that you may know, Sarah Homa Bazafkan. Yeah, she said, these protests are no longer just protests, but the beginning of a new revolutionary era in Iran.
Yeah.
How do you square that, Sarah, with what you just said, that you don't want to give up hope, but it's getting pretty dire? And I know others that I speak with have a same sense of despair. There was really an almost an exuberance in the aftermath of the Masa Amini, with all the protests around the world and in Iran, but the repression seems to have been just relentless, and you don't hear about it so much anymore, except for the numbers of executions. So how would you square what Michael just said about this marks actually a new phase in the revolution? What do you think that this woman means?
So I think it's really true. It's a new revolutionary movement, a new revolutionary era, because it's changing perspectives. It's changing Iranians' perspectives towards paternalism, towards patriarchy, right? It is challenging value concepts, deep-seated value concept, not just in Iran, but also in the Middle East. And I would say all around the world, more or less, right? We still see patriarchy in Western countries too, right?
Mm-hmm.
We are dealing with this.
So it's more of a cultural.
It's very cultural. Yeah, it's very cultural. That's why I never say that I hope like the regime is gone this year. I say I hope this movement continues.
Yeah.
Right? Because if it continues, the foundation, because I always believe that the foundation matters most. The foundation, the roots of this change matter. That's why I think we have to work at culture. Dr. Homa Hutfar, actually, Michael mentioned in our webinar last month that she was emphasizing on working at culture, listening to each other, and strengthening the pillars of culture. Why I'm saying this? Because, as I said, like my dad, other Iranians who think that they are responsible to admonish us, to violate our privacy. So this movement taught us how to work to change people's perspectives, and to, like, let me give you an example. Like, men in Iran, many men who were a little bit religious, not that much, but a little bit, because of the like common norms, or like it was so deep rooted, they were a bit traditional, and they sometimes like admonish their sisters, their wives. I'm sure that you have heard it a lot, that over the past couple of months they stopped admonishing their sisters, they stopped admonishing their wives. They are even afraid of doing this.
Wow.
Because they think that if they start admonishing like their wives, saying that, oh, fix your hijab, instead of fixing that hijab, they completely remove that, right? This is a blatant defiance, right? So this is a big change. This is a huge change. Yeah, that's why I always say, and in my, like the conference last Saturday, I mentioned that this movement should be considered global. If we consider ourselves global citizens, So this is a global movement, shaking patriarchy, shaking pillars of patriarchy, shaking not just like structure of patriarchy, but also its culture, you know. And women are not seeking just their rights. It's much further. They are going far beyond. They are seeking leadership. They are seeking agency that was ignored, you know, by the Islamic regime in Iran and other countries. So that's why the message of this movement is really important. And this is, I would say, a very different and unique revolutionary movement. And we are living in a very unique revolutionary era that we don't hear like these days much protests in Iran, but go to Tehran and other cities at night, see what you hear.
Yeah.
Streets, you see like what they are doing, removing their veils and just veiling or fixing their hijab in front of police. And right after that, they again remove their veils. So this is a huge change, which means that they say enough, no to bargaining with patriarchy. We don't want to bargain with patriarchy, because before that, Iranians, and actually most of women all around the world, they had to bargain with patriarchy in order to be able to work, to go to public spaces. But today, Iranian women, you know, stepped far beyond this. They don't want to bargain, and this is a huge change, I would say.
Yeah, I think you're making a profound point. I think, you know, the effect of the mass protests after Mahsa Amini was to strip the regime of any remaining legitimacy.
Exactly.
I mean, the king had no clothes after the protests, and it still doesn't have any clothes. And so it's falling back on increasing repression, but the ground is shifting under its feet. And then it's just a question of the judo and the creativity to keep that cultural foment going long enough for there to be, at some moment, a critical mass.
Yeah.
And like the Shah disappeared, you know, within weeks, you know, at some moment, this regime is going to disappear. It's just going to collapse under its own weight. Michael, what would be your comment on this?
First of all, ditto what you said, Jim. And you know, my profound hope, as it has always been, is that this revolution will make exactly the kind of impact on the world that Sarah was just describing. And perhaps, may we dare hope, go even beyond the disestablishment of patriarchy to the disestablishment of violence itself. Because patriarchy, horrible as it is and widespread as it is only one form of violence. And if we would, what I'd really love to see in this movement is to grasp that inner principle, that why we hate patriarchy is because it's violent. It denies the humanity of one person by another. And so we need to get deep enough that we can really apply this to all forms. That would be my hope.
Thank you so much, Michael. And Sarah, I'm going to give you the final word. What would you like to leave with our global community?
I have many words to say as my final notes. Something that I want to emphasize is taking the case of hijab and some reductionist views that's unfortunately we see among academics and everyday people, talking about the fact that, you know, the hijab in Iran is not that restrictive, it's not that difficult, right? So I just want to mention that this is not about the size of that piece of cloth, right? This is about the meaning behind it. You know, I always bring up this example that if Americans are imposed like to wear hat Do they accept it? Even if it's very easy for them, even if many of them may like it, but they don't accept it because it's an obligation. The meaning behind it matters, not the size of that piece of cloth, because unfortunately, I see among academics, they say that in Iran, women's body and head are half covered. It's not that restrictive. It's easy. They can go to work, they can drive, they can do this, they can do that. But they don't see the deep layers of this piece of cloth, right? It doesn't matter if women of Iran are forced to wear their entire, like their whole body and cover their face, or just their head, or like with a loose manteau, right? The meaning behind it matters. And I do think that this is a reductionist view, that we should work on it. We shouldn't underestimate this. We shouldn't simplify mandatory hijab by, you know, explaining that it's only a part of your head. Just your half head is covered. Just take it. Don't be hard on that, you know. This is exactly what supporters of actually women life freedom are fighting for. And I mentioned just a few minutes before, like, no to bargaining with patriarchy, right? Women of Iran have stepped far beyond that, far beyond this conformity, you know. And yeah, so, and I also want to mention that hijab is a very multi-dimensional, hyper-visible tool of oppression, you know, and we should know that clothing, as Professor Kashani Sabet mentions, is a barometer of politics. And as Foucault mentions, women's body and generally body is a place to exert power. So when we think about it, then we won't say that, okay, that hijab, that piece of cloth on your head and on your body won't be that restrictive. Take it. Don't die for that piece of cloth. It's not about that piece of cloth. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been really, really inspiring, both of you. A very good conversation on Iran. And Sarah, I would love to have you back from time to time as events unfold. I'm sure we're going to hear more about Iran. And just to remind everyone, the importance of Iran is this the first revolutionary protest, certainly in the modern era, that was ignited by young women. And that's momentous in terms of the cultural shift that is inevitable when young people and young women rise up in the way they have in Iran. So thank you, Sarah, for being on the front lines. And
thank you for having me. I'm really honored, and I would be honored to participate again. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot from you. Thank you, Michael.
And thank you, Michael, as ever.
Of course.
You're the great sage amongst us all.
one free speech movement better into another.
Bless you, Sarah. Bless
Yes,
you, bless you, bless you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So that brings us to a close for today, everyone. You'll all
I have to jump off, Jim. Sorry.
Yeah. You'll see the chat link in the chat box, and we'll see you tomorrow, where we're going to go from Iran to Mexico, and we're going to listen to a Toltec sorceress talk to us about the practice of recapitulation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael.